Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our daily Bible study. We are in Job 38 today. The construction workers outside that prevented us yesterday have apparently taken the weekend off because they're not there today. So that leaves us free to record. If you would like our PDF, you can download it at tobelikechrist.com. It's totally free, and now we're almost all the way through the book of Job, so we have almost all of the PDFs out there on the website if you'd like to go back and review any of the chapters. Chapter 38 is quite significant. We're going to finally move into the third section of the book where we see God responding to the debate that's been going on for the last 30-some chapters. Job and his friends have been going back and forth discussing things like God's righteousness, God's justice, how God treats the wicked versus treats those who follow his instructions and his laws. They've been hashing this over, and now finally God is going to give his definitive word, at least what he wants to say on this matter, to clear things up and to kind of bring it to a resolution. And one thing you're going to notice is that God is going to speak to Job in these next couple chapters. His words are going to be directed towards Job. Now, we will discuss his friends and what God thinks of his friends towards the end of this discussion, but at first, it's all directed towards Job. So for our characters today, we have Job who's being spoken to, and we have God who's doing the speaking, and he's speaking from a whirlwind, which may have been a part of that storm that Elihu has been talking about for the last two chapters. As we go over to page number 2, you'll notice it's full, mostly full of the outline today. We have 41 verses to cover. The reason the outline is longer, though, is because I wanted to include as many of God's words and as many of God's questions as I could, rather than taking up most of this page with my own words in the application section. So the application is a little bit shorter today because I wanted to fit as much of God's words in here as possible. I have entitled the chapter, God Questions Job. Again, we have 41 verses, and I'll just let you know up front, God's not going to give Job the answer that maybe we might expect or that he was expecting. He isn't going to reveal Satan's work that we got to read about in Job chapter 1 and 2. He's not going to say, well, this is all Satan's fault, and that's what you need to know, blame him, and you shouldn't be blaming me. He's not, he could have responded that way to Job, but he chooses not to. Instead, he's going to reassure Job that he is in control. He is going to remind Job that his governance of the world is too complex for men to understand, and he's going to challenge Job on some of the unwise things that he said throughout the book. In the last chapter, we're going to see God supporting Job, vindicating him, and rebuking his friends. Okay, so as we read this chapter, I think it can be a little bit striking because God is a little bit harsh, I think, with Job. He calls him to account with some of the things that he said. Maybe Job has been a little too bold in his line of questioning. Maybe his friends were actually somewhat right about that, and God is going to call him to account for that. But we have to balance God's challenge of Job to what we read about in chapter 42, where God ultimately is going to tell Job's friends that they're the ones who are in the wrong and that Job had spoken rightly. So we have to harmonize those. Don't think that God is coming down harder on Job as you're reading these first couple chapters and that he's going to let his friends get off the hook. That's not it at all. God spoke to Job from this whirlwind, and God said, quote, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Who's this who's speaking from their ignorance and mixing things up and confusing the facts?" Now the question is here, is God speaking to Job or is he speaking to Elihu? Because Elihu had just finished speaking, and we know that not everything that he said was correct. So it's somewhat hard to say who God is speaking to here. I've read several interpretations. Some think it's Elihu, some think it's Job. I think it's fair to say that this could apply to both. Both of them had said some things in their ignorance that maybe they really shouldn't have said. In the next verse, though, and in verses 3 through 41, it becomes clear that the following line of questioning, the following words, is going to be directed to Job. And primarily in the next couple chapters, God is going to be talking to Job, not to Job's friends. Job had questioned God. He had wanted to bring God to court, to ask questions, to demand responses, right? Now it's God's turn to question Job. Job had insisted that God give him answers, and now God was going to require some answers of Job if he could give them. This chapter is a series of questions that God asks to Job to humble him and to make him appreciate the majesty and the complexity of the eternal Creator. And I'll just let you know, Job's not going to be able to answer even one of God's questions. And this will cause him to immediately question whether or not he went a little too far in demanding answers from God and insisting that God give him reasons for what he was going through. God asks him this first. He says, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who determined its measurements? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? God's going to be talking about creation and about his power, his ability to do things, this power, this ability, this knowledge that Job doesn't have. He's going to use a lot of figurative language like the foundations, the cornerstone of the earth. We're going to see more of that figurative language in God's questioning moving forward. He asked Job, who shut in the sea with doors when it bursts out from the womb, and prescribed limits for it, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. He says, who put the ocean in its place and created a boundary of where those waves and where the tide would cross, and where it would end and where it would begin? Obviously, God's like, I did that. What do you know of that, Job? Job's at this point like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. God asked Job if he had ever commanded the sunrise to start in the morning. He asked if Job knew about the caves and the valleys of the deep ocean. He says this in verse 17, have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Verse 18, have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? God asked, quote, where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. And I have listed there. It's like, there's some sarcasm there if you didn't catch it. He says, God's like, where does light come from? Where does darkness come from? He's like, tell me, Job, you're so old. You've been around this long, right? You've been around since the creation of the world. Tell me all of the things that you know. So sarcasm is not... sarcasm is a God, what's the word I'm looking for? It comes, it's not absent from God's character. Did Job understand the weather? Did he understand the rain or storms or ice or hail or frost? Elihu already said that they didn't understand those things in a previous chapter. Job didn't just lack knowledge to answer these questions, he also lacked God's power. Could he preserve the constellations in the heavens? Of the constellation God specifically mentions Orion or the Pleiades in verse 31. Job may have known about the constellations. He could look up into the sky, but he didn't know anything about the natural laws that govern them. He didn't have the ability to move them across the sky every night. Was Job the origin of wisdom, God asks, or the creator of consciousness? God knew those things. God was created wisdom in the beginning. He created human consciousness, animal consciousness. What did Job know about these things? Could Job balance the ecosystem and give food to all of the created beings? Now, Job has already at this point realized that all of his responses to these questions is no. I don't know any of these things. No, I don't have the power to do any of these things. What we're going to see in chapter 39 is God continuing this line of questioning and Job admitting that he's in a position of being in darkness, of being in ignorance about a lot of things, and God is helping him realize that. So for application today, I mentioned that I had to keep it short, but I do still think it's dense in the difficulty of the application and the importance of the application. Let's all keep this line of questioning by God in mind before we speak too rashly about the circumstances of our lives and the God who oversees them. In the New Testament, Jesus tells us to be content, to be okay, to be accepting of our circumstances, in trust that God is going to take care of everything. In Matthew chapter 5, he talks about how we ought not to worry because God takes care of the animals, he takes care of the flowers, and that's kind of a mini lesson of what we're seeing here in this entire book of Job and what God is telling Job and how God is answering these questions that Job has. Although it's hard, we have to learn to be content. That contentment will not always stem from knowing the reason behind every detail of our circumstances. Sometimes that contentment will come from our general knowledge of God's sovereignty and an acceptance of his mysterious complexity that governs all things for good. So the lesson here is that we shouldn't only be able to find contentment when we know all of the details of every situation. We should be able to find contentment in the fact that we serve a good and sovereign God, and we trust that whatever is happening to us is under control, so we can be content in whatever situation we find ourselves in, whether we know lots of details about it or whether we're largely ignorant about it. That's going to wrap up our study in Job 38. I'm sure I'm over 5 minutes today, but some chapters, you just need a little bit more time. All right. I hope everyone has a great day. I hope God blesses you all, and I hope to join you tomorrow for Job 39, and we'll see more of God's questions and how Job initially responds to them.